Good morning. I'm Stacey Vandola Evans. I'm a global strategic executive for Schneider Electric. We're here today to discuss reforming the design build process and how that can improve smart building outcomes. I've got here some guests with me, which will introduce themselves now.
Thanks, Stacey. My name is Dominic Loughton. I'm the Director of Castrol Engineering Advisors. We're a company based in Auckland, New Zealand, and we specialize in the design and specification of building management systems and integrated technology.
Hi, Stacey, and hi, Dominic. So my name's Tom Randall. I work at Arup. For those who don't know, we're an international multidisciplinary engineering consultancy. I work within our building performance and systems team. So we specialize in building control systems and also the investigation and improvement of the operational performance of buildings.
So as you can see, we've got two people here who really live inside the whole area of redesign and reform. And we know that we're living through what is climate crisis, and sustainability is on the forefront of every big corporate and everybody's minds on what we need to do today to get to net zero. And we see electrification of 4.0 and digitalization as key drivers to these particular things, achieving these outcomes. Arup in 2019 released a very good white paper example called FM 2.0, and it's really here to discuss why these things and these outcomes are important and how we drive these changes in our building and our industry. So Tom, can I ask you a question? Can you explain the premise for Arup's vision for FM 2.0?
Yeah, sure, Stacey. I mean, firstly, I think to acknowledge that it was work that's led by my colleague, Stephen Hill, who also sort of works closely in this space of the operational performance of new and existing buildings. It was the core of it was to get improved building performance through the application of digital technology. But to unpack that a little bit more, building performance is across the board in terms of the functional requirements of a building. So, for example, a comfortable, productive space for the occupants, but also a building that is more efficient and easy to manage. So it's easier for the facilities management team to be more strategic and targeted in terms of how they manage and maintain the building, rather than being sort of reactive, which tends to be more of the norm. And then a overall consequence of both of those things is that you end up with more productive occupants. And if it's a building that's commercially owned, it can, in many circumstances, result in increased rental income and increased asset value.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there, Tom. And so it's really reinforcing the importance of the digital technologies and the building outcomes. So Dominic, what is your opinion of the vision for the future of facility management?
I guess essentially the key drivers for FM 2.0 will be there's either going to be a paradigm shift in the way consultants engage with FM stakeholders, or FM stakeholders engage with their consultants in a different way. Who comes first in that process? It's a bit of a gamble sometimes. Sometimes you get a very sophisticated FM. Sometimes you get a very sophisticated consultant. When the two of them meet, you get great outcomes. If none of them come to the party together, outcomes tend to be pretty average, pretty typical.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so yeah, absolutely. I think, from our perspective, sort of sitting over the top of both the consultant and the FM, and what we're seeing as a real driver is simply the demands of the clients. And essentially, they are moving from where, in terms of demonstrating the quality of a building, getting something like a BREEAM certificate, a LEED certificate, or a WELL certificate would be sufficient. But they don't demonstrate how the building's performing day in, day out, and they're starting to understand that. And the investment market is starting to understand that, and the occupant tenant market is starting to ask that. So what we are seeing is that at the very top of the client chain, they're demanding this. So therefore, to deliver what they are now more explicitly requiring, both the design consultants and the FM companies are needing to up their game, because if they don't, then they're not going to survive, in short, because they're not going to be delivering the performance that the market is now demanding from buildings.
Yeah, so what what we're really seeing here is around what the roadblocks and speed bumps are to really to enable these smart buildings and connected assets to be available for the use in FM. And from example, from experience, the digital infrastructure is going to be key in the future for driving operational outcomes. But from your point of view, what needs to happen, Dominic, in your opinion, that's really going to make those changes in the process?
Yeah, so I think some of the challenges that I see quite often in the industry, I'm not sure about sort of more global markets, but definitely in the Asia Pacific region. Traditionally, BMS has been the domain of mechanical design engineers, so it's specified on the mechanical contract. It's written up by mechanical design engineers who obviously specify mechanical building services. So with that being said, BMS traditionally sitting under mechanical in a modern context of system integration poses the challenge of, are your designers and specifiers able to deal with some of the technological the subtleties of system integration? So for example, with IT/OT convergence, a lot of traditional BMS networks that were serial using RS-485, BACnet MSTP, Modbus RTU, they're now going onto that IP layer. Now, in modern buildings, that IP layer has to serve two functions. It's got to serve the occupants' needs in the building, so business functions, and then has to serve building functions as well. And sometimes, if requirements not articulated well, those two sort of requirements can conflict with each other on projects in general. So specifiers, designers need to become a bit more sophisticated to understand those needs and articulate them well, collaborate a lot earlier with the right stakeholders, the key stakeholders, so the facility manager, the actual client stakeholder, which could be a client sponsor, so it could be someone representing the client or the actual client themselves, and potentially technology specialists such as Schneider, and the constructor, the actual builder too, the main contractor. That way, everyone is familiar with what the outcomes need to be. I've seen projects come out really well when alliance models are used. So instead of working in silos from an early onset, it's the whole project paradigm is about collaboration for us, an integrated system outcome.
That's a really on point there, Dominic. I mean, what we've seen as a technology provider, so in this global leading technology provider, where we've worked with design consultants like Arup and yourselves, when we've got into the detail of understanding OT/IT convergence, we can see there are cost and capex implications that are hugely beneficial. Reduces cost and risk. But these are the kind of things through the whole process that don't get seen. Because of that process through QSs and how they approach it with procurement. We see there's a long drawn out process of selecting a site and planning, but as soon as somebody clicks that button, all of a sudden there's no time. And Tom, I'm sure you're aware of this in your role, where all of a sudden you're expected to deliver this highly complex building in what is now a very short amount of time. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely, and I think going on from the point of there's a big driver essentially coming from the top. The problem is that you've both touched on, we're dealing with legacy approaches and processes to picking up that client requirement and delivering, which means even though they might see the document that says the client wants this building that performs to a higher level day in, day out, if they default to their existing ways of going about it, they're not speaking with an IT consultant, they go through value engineering processes that don't understand that making certain substitutions or fundamentally undermine a headline influence on the commercial value of this project, then will continue to fail. So I think fundamentally, now that the demands of buildings are being reframed by clients, there's essentially a root and branch need to review almost every responsibility, every process, every interaction between different professionals involved in a project to make sure that baton is carried all the way through to ensure that that building gets sort of delivered, that performs well in operation. So picking up Dominic's excellent example, those that were traditionally responsible for controls, mechanical engineers or controls, even like traditional control specialists, they need to understand and work with sort of dedicated technology specialists and what it means in terms of integration with broader, more generic IT, IP systems, and obviously sort of cybersecurity is a major issue in that space. And then similarly, which you allude to, Stacey, quite a lot of projects that in some way have the smart badge. I think it's important to make the point these are in many ways evolutions of what we used to do, not always profound changes, but if a quantity surveyor or cost consultant doesn't fully understand the implications of that new approach, they might be inclined to take it out. Sincerely, from their perspective, it's just that they haven't professionally joined the dots of what the consequences are there to undermine something that is now critical and, you know, affects bottom line commercial interest in a building in terms of how the building performs, what the rental income is, what the asset value is.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, Tom, like you were saying, is really driven by those historic processes. I mean, and also the speed of technology. You know, working for a global technology provider like Schneider, I know the speed of technology and how that changes so quickly. And obviously, it's very difficult for, you know, the industry and the construction industry and the processes within that industry to really, you know, stay at pace with us and other technology providers as well. So I'm thinking around, you know, sort of how then do we help the industry, you know, through the design process? You know, how do we influence that? How do we change our own processes even to really help to deliver the outcomes that we, you know, your colleagues and yourselves talked about in FM 2.0? You know, what are those key things that need to change? And I think so Tom would be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think a headline there for me, and it's the word you use, is outcome. It's try and be as explicit as possible about the outcome. I mean, for example, picking up your point about the rate of change, it's quite easy, you know, some, you know, consultants and, well, for example, have like a preferred technology and they might say, we'll use this technology, but that's already distracting from, you know, the main point is what is the outcome, you know, explicitly, what do you need in terms of the performance, cybersecurity, interactions with the occupants, be they technical FM, be they the non-technical occupants. You know, that is fundamentally what matters. And the point being that then helps keep focus in amongst the noise of how new this area is to so many, particularly, you know, with clients who don't tend to get too technical, but even consultants, where, as you say, Stacey, technology still emerges very, you know, it's changing quite rapidly, but you need to be able to have that solid ground of saying, oh, right, well, actually, in the last year, this technology is bubbling up. Do we use it or not? Well, you need something solid to cross-check that against to help make a decision. So like real explicit clarity on the outcomes for me is a fundamental sort of grounding, so that, you know, particularly, you know, working with engineers, we could all get excited about, you know, new technology, but also just because it's new and we can almost get distracted. Yeah. So that solid grounding, that reference point.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to come on to Dominic about this point, but I think there's a, you know, where I've seen real success and is around where, you know, we've created innovation labs, or, you know, and got the different technologies together at the early part of the process and done that technical review with the design consultant, with the various parties in the IT, you know, the FM, and actually reviewed, well, what was the outcome and how did the technology work? And actually, you know, there was a clear example of this where the end user, the client, wanted a particular system, but when we put that system in and tested it with all the other systems, we found that actually it didn't integrate that well. It wasn't really doing what they wanted it to do. But because that decision was made very, very early on, it allowed them to then re-select a different technology that was more appropriate for what their long-term uses were. And as you said, Tom, they were selecting that technology from an historic perspective because it's what they already had, it's what they knew, and they felt comfortable with it. But actually, it wasn't really the right technology for the next 20 years for that facility. So Dominic, I mean, I'm sure you've come across this, and I'd be very interested to get your thoughts.
Yeah, again, I agree with a lot of the things Tom touched on there, and the same things you mentioned, Stacey. Something that I tend to do as part of my projects with my customers is in that early engagement phase. So outcomes is very important. That sets the general direction you're going to go in terms of developing a solution. Something that I also sort of carry out as part of that use case discovery phase, that initial journey with the customer, is get an understanding. And it's a very personal sort of question that I ask them, and not many customers sort of initially are very comfortable answering it. But I do ask the question of have you allocated a budget for your technology requirements? Have you allocated a budget for system integration? Because sometimes clients will sort of have very grand ideas about what they want, and like you said, Stacey, not every technology is sort of shoeboxed into one approach. You can sort of find multiple solutions to a client's requirement or problem. So I tend to ask the question initially of has a budget been allocated for technology? And if it hasn't, I've sort of advised them and recommend to them that they should allocate a budget for it. What that does in the entire project process is it captures part of that capital works project phase, and it defines that part of it. And therefore, you can transfer that into the construction phase and then onto your outcome. So even if you had to value engineer from that initial budget, at least the expectation is set that it will then have an impact on the outcome, but people can start negotiating or discussing that. If you don't have that discussion, it's very hard to sort of bring a bit of an understanding context to technology, especially when dealing with ones and zeros. How do you assign dollars to ones and zeros? It's a little bit of a difficult discussion to have for a lot of people. So to contextualize it, I always start with, what are we dealing with? What sort of flexibility do you have in terms of a budget? And then will that budget get you the outcome? Because matching outcomes to that initial spend, that's quite important, because you could be trying to do something very innovative, but you're thinking it can be done at a very sort of plug and play approach. But sometimes a bit more thought and innovation, customization is required to get certain outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tom, well, I mean, what are your thoughts on that as well? Just from just wrapping up what Dominic was saying.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a very wise step. I mean, it's an extension of that sort of making sure that once the value of what those improved building performance outcomes are acknowledged, sort of codifying and capturing that, because part of that, we are saying early on explicitly they want to come by the application of new digital technologies, digital approaches. Well, therefore, a logical step that isn't the default is to recognize it with its own budget. So I think as a way of explicitly building it in, so that it's harder, it cannot get pushed out without a conscious decision about, right, we've got this technology budget because we think this is essentially a new area that we need to invest in for this project to achieve it, and therefore it's explicit. If that gets touched, then there are likely to be outcomes in terms of the fundamental objective. I think it's a very wise approach and a good example of a systemic change that would benefit the industry in terms of making sure that you get these improved outcomes.
Yeah, and I think this that for me as well, is where I've seen is that looking at the tangible benefits as to why people should change. Having done a number of studies with yourselves and with other people, and getting into that level of detail and nitty gritty of how the different technologies interact across the different silos, but equally how they transcend across the different aspects of the whole process of delivering a project. So how does that technology impact the contractor, the GC, the M&E? How does it impact the FM? How does it impact the developer? What are the key benefits? For contractors that we know are often driven by risk and equally cost. So again, it's to get these operational outputs. It's again letting them understand and making it less complicated. So it's really moving from the what to do and why to do it to actually, well, what's the value to them actually doing it? And I think then we're going to start to see people start to say, oh, actually, this is in my interest. This is beneficial to me. And if you can align all those things, I think we stand far more chance of actually, getting these outputs that we want. But I think, as Dominic and Tom, you both said, that the key thing is to start that whole piece. Technologies really, and not really the tail end Charlie anymore. It needs to be at the forefront of these. Software needs to be at the forefront. The outcomes of that needs to be at the forefront of the projects. So Dominic, how do you think we're going to drive these tangible benefits and move from the what to the why and to get this thing moving faster and the speed of adoption?
That's a really good question, Stacey. And look, it's So lots of these points can be debated. In fact, you probably do a whole discussion around the benefits aspects of this. But I guess some key benefits that I've sort of seen in my engagement with the market in New Zealand is if you consider sort of the whole chain of the process. So you start with the designers and you end with the facility managers. From the designer's perspective, if you think about their process, they might spend maybe something like 6 to 8 months on a complex project to do the actual the design specification. But the build phase could be 18, 24 months, maybe 3 years if it's a very large project. So the benefit for a designer would be that their fees that they are able to sort of maintain and hold during the construction phase will have, I guess, less time wasted in answering variations and more time spent just basically tick boxing your outcomes that you define during your design phase. What that does mean, though, is that your design phase needs to be pretty robust. So a good solid use case, very clear understanding of what direction the project needs to go in. The other thing that I've sort of seen is the more detail you put up front, it's easier to get, I guess, more competitive bidding on the project. Very often I see very loose specifications that I tend to review for other consultants. And you can get variations between building management system contractors plus minus 25% sometimes. But very tightly well-defined specifications, functional descriptions, even where there's design drawings. So, you know, if you're designing electrical infrastructure with single line diagrams, well, control systems probably would benefit from having schematics and drawings put together as well as a specification too. Where more comprehensive packages are put together for technology procurement, you can have plus minus 5% as opposed to plus minus 25%. So from the client's perspective, that's obviously a win for them. They get sort of more competitive pricing. They get more value for their budget as well. It means that you're able to review tenders more closely because you can do a more apples for apples review on that procurement. The other thing is for the builder, it simplifies their construction process. So by adding a bit more detail and defining what that outcome is, it makes it easier for the builder to manage the job in the right direction. Because they also are very clear about what the outcome has to be. So value engineering doesn't necessarily mean taking stuff out. It now means how can we maybe take a different approach to achieving the same outcome, which then has maybe benefits for cost, scope, time, and value. In general, for the end customer, fewer variations means less money wasted to solve problems and more money on the actual outcome. And from a management perspective, operations perspective, if you think about it like this, a very well-defined integrated system will be simple for the user to understand and engage with, even though there's lots of back-end complexity because it's been well thought out. So the system, if it's simple to maintain, but it provides sort of a facility manager with all the tools and processes to improve their workflow, their Monday to Friday job, then that's a huge benefit for them. It's almost like having another employee who basically never sleeps and tells you exactly the honest truth about how buildings are operating, whether systems are offline, online, how efficiently things are going. And effectively, I guess to put it bluntly, you don't have to pay that BMS system a salary. I mean, there might be some operational cost to maintain it, but it's not going to take a sick leave. It's not going to sort of try and fudge numbers and stuff like that. It's just going to tell you the truth. It's very black and white. And so in terms of all the stakeholders along the chain, you know, doing this right going forward, there's huge benefits. And it's just a case of in this initial evolutionary phase of the industry, you know, good projects tend to sort of be a bit scarce now. But once there's a bit of a critical mass of some of this, then customers are going to be knocking on doors saying, how do we get that outcome? How did you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I've seen some of these, I've been involved in some of these projects over my, you know, long sort of career in this industry. And I can think of, you know, the best project that I ever worked on, where the project, and actually, you know, interestingly, this was a construction company, and the construction company decided to take a completely different approach to the normal processes that they would go through they wanted a smart building, they wanted an intelligent building that they could really show off to their customers. But what they did, and they took a completely different approach. They actually they brought in with the consultant the technology providers, and they interviewed the technology providers through a sort of two-stage process, and they had the whole team around the table. So you had the IT, you had a FM, you had all the different stakeholders around, and they went through a whole process, and then they selected the different technology providers that they wanted to deliver the different packages. But as a result of doing that, they created a group, if you want, of people who then collaborated. So, for instance, the company providing the CCTV had a particular CCTV system that 슈나이더 already had an integration done. They'd already done that work up front. So actually we removed a lot of cost from that integration, because actually we didn't need to do the engineering work. It simplified the whole process, but we would have never known that, and they wouldn't have known that, if we hadn't been brought together as a design team under one designer. So Tom, again, that same question to you.
Yep. So again, I'd go sort of upper level in terms of really the fundamental sort of client requirements. So, I mean, in simple terms, I'd argue that a good building is efficient to operate in terms of sort of cost and resources and carbon. It's effective for the occupants in terms of what it's there to be, a comfortable, productive space, or, a hospital, it's effective for people getting better. If it's a commercial building, it's valuable in terms of rental income and asset value. And they're the headlines. And I think what we're seeing in terms of sort of driving innovation is clients holding designs to account more. We will be monitoring the operational performance of this building, and you really are going to be tested against what you can deliver. So therefore, in that context, it really, we are seeing drives. First, the additional rigor, full stop, in a traditional sense. We in the UK recently have adopted, the private commercial property owners have voluntarily started adopting a variation of the Australian Neighbours Operational Energy Rating, which we're calling Neighbours UK, which at its heart, it's really simple. The rating you get is based on the actual performance of a building, unlike an energy performance certificate or a partial calculation, which is just a model. And as designers, as various supply chain providers, you are going to be held to account as to whether or not that delivers. And therefore, if as part of that, you think you can deliver that outcome through innovation, through technology, then you can propose it. It can be assessed in a, ideally in the more rigorous way that both of you have articulated. And then the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Sort of, you will see in reality if it performs. That's just energy. But firstly, certainly as you two will understand, but for the benefit of many others, if you're trying to make a building perform better in terms of energy, you are by your nature paying more attention to how the building is running, which actually works really well with more efficient maintenance, where you are sort of more targeted at your time and financial resources at improving and maintaining the performance of the building in terms of it actually responds, rather than arbitrarily checking equipment X times a year or replacing it because it's X years old. So it goes hand in hand with more efficient maintenance as well, in addition to which those other factors such as the comfort, the internal environmental performance, there's nothing stopping, even historically, but even more so with digital technologies, monitoring those environmental conditions every single day. WELL certification, it's great in terms of your environmental conditions. It's a point in time test. Well, on that day, your air quality might have been great, but what about the under 364 days that building might be occupied? And in terms of where the power is, a client and occupant can now monitor the performance of those things day in, day out, and therefore by extension hold the facilities manager, hold the contractors, hold the designers to more account, which I have no qualms about. We should be delivering better performing buildings.
Yeah, so thank you to Dominic and Tom. And so to conclude, Dominic, it'd be really great to get your, what are your key takeaways really from the main things that we've discussed today?
Yeah, so I'd say sort of some key takeaways that I think could be applied to lots of projects to get better technology integration outcomes is collaborate early, develop a detailed design, agree on the design, set aside a budget if you can, if it's possible, and I guess do a use case stress test on that design as well. So I think if all those things are done early enough in the project phase, and this can be done right up to the point of issuing tender documents, I think outcomes will naturally be de-risked. They'll sort of drive more towards what the client's expectation is.
Yeah, I totally agree and 100% agree with you there, Dominic. So thank you, Dominic, and Tom. Same to you. Thank you for your time today and your input into this session. And the same question to you. I mean, what is your key takeaways and things that you want people to take away from our discussions?
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. I think, so picking up from Dominic, the focus is just keeping a focus on why we're talking about smart technology and digital technology, and it's not for the sake of it. It's not because everybody else is. What's behind this is that the market is demanding verifiably better performing buildings, and that these are the technologies that are able to deliver that. Occupants, developers, landlords are wanting buildings that demonstrably are more comfortable, more energy efficient, and as a consequence for many of them worth more, and they increasingly know how to check that that's happening. So essentially, these technologies are ways of many of those in the supply chain through design, construction, through to operation, so to simply more effectively deliver what the market is after. And either they understand that and adopt that, meet those demands and succeed, or they will get left behind.
Absolutely, Tom. And again, thank you very much for your time today. So for me, I think we have the real need here to drive digitization in the industry, really to transform, how we design and build and these buildings that we live and work in today. And I think this is going to really help solve some of the challenges and with greater collaboration we discussed about, and risk accountability, working more collaboratively, sharing some of the risks involved in this process, engaging earlier, looking at the sustainability outcomes to get to net zero, which is something that we're all really passionate about, obviously from a climate perspective. So thank you very much, gentlemen. And for anyone who's really enjoyed our session today, we are working on a new white paper, which we'll be releasing later this year with Dominic and Tom and other parties as well from different parts of the industry. And that's really to build on the FM 2.0 white paper that Arup released in 2019. And with this new white paper is Designing for Facility Management 2.0. This is around changing how digital systems are specified to achieve smart building outcomes. So again, we'll be obviously raising that, and we're doing some live sessions later on in the year when we can get the various parties for Q&A, and you can actually engage with us on this topic. So thank you very much, Dominic and Tom. I hope you've enjoyed speaking today.
Yep.
Thanks both.
Thank you, Stacey. Cheers, Dominic.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Stacey.